The year is 1857. Queen Victoria rules the British Empire, and Charles Darwin first discusses his theory of evolution. In America, Minnesota becomes the 32nd state. A lawyer named Abraham Lincoln runs for Senate. He will lose. The Civil War won't start for 3 more years, but both sides prepare for battle. And in New York City, a man begins his legacy by transforming a notorious sewage dump into one of the world's most famous landmarks. It's not the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's not the Statue of Liberty, nor is it the Empire State Building. New York City's largest and most endearing landmark is the huge patch of green called Central Park. The man who envisioned it is Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of landscape architecture. This is his story.
My name is Frederick Law Olmsted. My profession is landscape architecture. I supervise a successful and most respected firm which designs and constructs landscape projects, primarily parks, all over our great country.
As I look back on my life and many accomplishments, I recall how hard it was getting started, how fate kept throwing obstacles in my path, causing me to fail on numerous occasions.
And yet, how lucky I was that the Almighty gave me the strength to continue and ultimately succeed. I wish to speak to you about my early life and show you my work, particularly my first project, a park in New York City.
I was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822. My dear mother passed away when I was only 4. God bless her soul. My father owned a successful mercantile store in Hartford.
He was a deeply religious man, and without my mother's help, he felt it was important to educate my brother John and I in a religious manner. So I was sent away to an endless variety of boarding schools by my father, which were long on religious discipline, but unfortunately short on academic instruction.
I spent most of my childhood lazily passing time in the rural countryside of Connecticut. My brother John and I would spend weekends with our father, and his favorite activity was taking us on long carriage rides through the rural country. I enjoyed the picturesque beauty of rural Connecticut, and this provided me with a lifelong love of natural scenery and outdoor activities.
As I grew older, I sought more adventure, and an opportunity was presented to work aboard a merchant ship, the Ronaldson, bound for Canton, China, and I eagerly joined the crew.
My initial excitement quickly evaporated, however, in the grim reality of a seaman's life. First, I was injured. Then, I contracted typhoid fever as well as scurvy. I worked hard and slept little, but I found time to read some of the great works of literature.
After a year at sea, I returned to New York, exhausted and demoralized. My life as a seaman was thankfully over. I unfortunately had failed at this endeavor, but I had learned much that would help me in the future. I learned how a captain managed rough and uneducated men to accomplish complex and dangerous tasks. And by reading great books, I taught myself to write effectively. Now it was time to seek a career. I had read several books on agriculture. I always enjoyed working outdoors, and I decided to try my hand at farming.
With my father's help, I purchased a farm on Staten Island. This is a sketch of the farmhouse, which I named Southside. I soon began writing articles about my farming endeavors.
I was so interested in all aspects of farming that I embarked on another overseas adventure, this time to England, with the intention of writing about the farming practices there.
During my travels, I discovered a park near Liverpool called Birkenhead that had been carefully designed to imitate the landscape of the English countryside, with lakes, trees, meadows, and curving carriage paths. Contrasting with traditional private estates, this was a public park and open to all classes of people.
I was quite impressed and remarked that we had no such park in America.
My journal of this trip became my first book, The Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England.
I wrote and published more and became quite proficient, as well as acquiring several influential journalists in New York City as my friends.
One of these friends was Andrew Jackson Downing, the famous landscape designer and also editor of The Horticulturalist, a popular New York City magazine. Mr. Downing led a campaign in his magazine strongly advocating a public park for New York City that would appear to be natural scenery.
I was proud to be associated with his efforts to create a new park, and he became my mentor.
Unfortunately, he drowned in a ferry boat accident shortly thereafter. The living conditions for many in New York City in 1850 were crowded, noisy, and accompanied by squalor. There had been a large migration of people from Ireland, where the conditions unfortunately were far worse. And now a lack of clean drinking water and poor sanitation brought on frequent outbreaks of fever and disease. Most of the city's residents had no occasion to see any of the Connecticut countryside that I had enjoyed as a boy. I was convinced that access to rural scenery in a natural park would help improve their difficult situation.
This is Manhattan Island in the 1850s. Just north of the city, you can see the old Croton Reservoir, which provided the city's water supply, but was no longer large enough, and the city was planning to build a new one, but much larger.
Thanks to Mr. Downing's campaign, the city decided a public park should be constructed around the old reservoir.
The population of New York City was not expected to expand this far north, so it seemed a prudent and relatively rural location for the new park.
The park property was rocky, swampy, and it had a rather foul smell from the bone-boiling works. There was little pleasant scenery to speak of, and it was most notable for the significant population which resided there, consisting mostly of stray goats and pigs from the city.
By this time, my attempt at farming had failed, and I was traveling around the country, writing for newspapers and authoring books of my own. Journalism was now my new career, and I found immense joy in it.
With my father's help, I bought into a publishing business, Dix Company of New York City. 9 months later, I received word that the company was in financial difficulty. Another failure, I feared. I soon found myself owing a great sum of money and unemployed. I was despondent and facing an uncertain future.
But God Almighty must have been watching over me, because my life was about to change again. With providential good luck, by writing a petition with over 200 signatures from my influential journalistic friends, and by aggressively presenting myself, where I might have slightly stretched my management skills and experience, I was hired as the new park superintendent.
My job was to supervise the workmen who drained the swamps and cleared brush and rocks from the difficult park site.
I was thrilled to have a job of any kind, and particularly excited about the potential of this one, which required that I spend most of my time outdoors.
But I also recognized the challenge. Not only would my supervisory responsibilities be formidable, but the corrupt city politics would make the job even more difficult.
I told my brother John that I would be honest and conscientious and attempt to organize an efficient workforce. And if that failed, at least it would be another good experience. As I look back, my fears and expectations were prophetic.
While I was engaged in clearing the property, Andrew Downing's former partner, an English architect named Clavert Vaux, informed me of a public competition to design a plan for the new park. And then he surprised me by asking if I would join him in preparing such a plan.
Well, I had no knowledge of architecture or landscape design, for that matter, and could not understand how I would be of any assistance at all. But we indeed collaborated.
We worked nights and weekends, and both our families joined in the drawing of hundreds of trees and thousands of dots for the great lawns. Our main drawing was 10 feet long.
Ours was the last plan submitted, and we just barely managed to finish and beat the deadline.
We called our plan Greensward. It was an unlikely park site, too long and too narrow, interrupted by future city streets which traversed the property, and it required a large area for the new reservoir next to the old one.
Andrew Downing had prepared no specific plan for the park, but he had written that pedestrians would find quiet and secluded walks when they wished to be solitary, and broad alleys filled with thousands of happy faces when they would be gay.
Vaux and I reasoned that our plan needed an extraordinary feature to set it apart from the other competitors, so we concentrated on Downing's idea of a broad alley. We designed a striking quarter-mile-long alley or promenade for pedestrians to stroll and be seen by their friends. We conceived a park with rural scenery, trees, meadows, lakes, and curving carriage roads as well as pedestrian paths.
Well, dear God, the Park Commission chose our plan as the most outstanding design of the 33 submitted. Vaux and I were quite happy, particularly about the $2,000 prize money.
Soon thereafter, I was appointed architect-in-chief of the new park. The project that would change my life had begun.
And so had my problems. My supervisor as well as several park commissioners and park employees, had also submitted plans, and they tried to change ours. Our competitors on the commission took out newspaper advertisements and had their political friends write editorials criticizing our plan and extolling theirs. But I had friends in the newspaper business as well, and our editorials and arguments won public favor, and our plan prevailed.
As construction began, one of our first surprises was the soil was not suitable for growing trees, shrubs, or great grass lawns. We had to import bargeful after bargeful of soil from New Jersey, transport it to the construction site, and then spread it on the ground, all by horse-drawn wagons and thousands of able-bodied men. The work was proceeding well, with 2,000 men operating as an efficient organization.
And then a great personal tragedy occurred. My brother John died of tuberculosis while traveling in Europe with his family.
John had never been a healthy lad and did not thrive in the outdoors as I always had. So I always looked after him as his older brother. I was proud and envious when he graduated from Yale College, started his career as a physician, married, and became a father.
He was my only true friend, and I loved him dearly. John's last words in his final letter to me were, "Don't let Mary suffer while you are alive." My brother's wife, Mary Olmsted, was now a widow with 3 young children. I arranged for them to return to New York and stay at my farm.
We consoled each other in our sorrow and became good friends. I felt a profound sense of duty to care for her and the children, and we soon married.
The wedding took place in the park, conducted by the mayor of New York City. It was rather convenient for me because I could continue to call her Mrs. Olmsted.
Since the park was situated in the center of Manhattan Island, it was named Central Park. Our design was intended to provide natural scenery for all classes of people, to calm their nerves and counteract the stresses of city life. The park provided 3 playing fields, a parade ground, a music pavilion, and winter ice skating pond. This was an ambitious plan and would take many years to complete. Our central feature was the promenade, now called the Mall. We intended it to be used for formal affairs and important civic events, as well as a place for the public to see and be seen. It was planted with a double row of beautiful American elm trees on each side. We placed it at a diagonal to the linear park property to maximize the unobstructed view toward a high prospect point at the old reservoir. The mall ended at a stairway which descended to the Bethesda Terrace below. The stairway gave everyone a grand view of the terrace, fountain, and lake. The fountain is represented by an angel above, overlooking the water basin and the large circular terrace. This was Vaux's contribution. We had many arguments over this fountain. I felt it was too representative of European nobility and not at all appropriate for a natural public park in America. But Vaux's design prevailed, and I must now admit it is quite a striking fountain. The music pavilion became extremely popular, when the city provided free Saturday afternoon concerts for everyone to enjoy. This is a gondola on the lake, with the fountain and terrace beyond, accommodating a holiday celebration. A celebration, I suspect, accompanied by too much ale and foolish behavior, which often occurred on holidays in the park. One of my responsibilities was keeping order, and I hired, trained, and managed a special park police force for the purpose. Their responsibilities were not only keeping order, but educating visitors on how to enjoy the park without destroying it. Of course, not everybody appreciated our extensive park rules. The city streets, which traversed the park, presented a difficult design problem. We didn't want the streets and traffic disrupting the park's picturesque beauty. We considered creating a wall of trees, but this would limit the landscape vistas I felt were essential for the rural feeling. Our idea was to put the streets out of sight and out of mind. We lowered the streets below the park, which gave the illusion of uninterrupted scenery, a simple and elegant solution. The park commissioners decided bridle paths, walking paths, and carriage paths in the park should all be separated to prohibit any disruptive intersections. This required designing over 40 expensive bridges, which hadn't been planned or budgeted in the original design. The separated paths were a good idea, but the construction delays and unplanned costs caused endless controversies between the commission and myself.
This made a complex project even more difficult for me. There was not enough time in the day to build this great park and argue design changes with the commissioners. And then another personal tragedy occurred.
Mary, myself, and our 2-month-old son, John Theodore, went for a carriage ride in the half-completed park. I wanted to try out a new horse I was thinking of buying.
I had worked myself to exhaustion and momentarily fell asleep, dropping the reins as we rounded the corner. When I stood to retrieve them, the carriage struck a lamppost and I was flung from the seat. It overturned with Mary and the baby. Thank God, both of them were unhurt.
However, I struck one of the park's mini rocks. My leg was shattered in 3 places, with bone protruding through my flesh. The doctor examined me and concluded that the leg should be amputated. However, I was so weak I could not have survived the surgery, so the doctor left it to God Almighty to heal my leg. Astonishingly, I survived, but with one leg shorter than the other, which left me with a noticeable limp the rest of my life.
And the tragedy was, the baby survived the accident, but a week later succumbed to cholera. God bless his little soul.
I had no time for grief or convalescence. The Central Park commissioners continually pressured me to speed up the construction, and thousands of workers depended on me to solve the daily problems of logistics and construction. One of these problems was Manhattan Island's famous rock. Oh dear God, that rock was the curse of our park. Vaux and I had greatly underestimated the quantity of it. We tried covering it with earth and plants. We tried digging it out with great difficulty. We even attempted blasting it with dynamite.
But no, this rock was stubborn indeed.
We finally accepted our fate and adapted our design to its picturesque charm. We also fabricated special devices for trimming the grass in the large meadows of our park. There were difficulties, however, with the livestock. The skating pond was completed in time for the first winter freeze, and everyone enjoyed the frozen fun. Central Park soon became popular, even fashionable, as a place for all classes of New Yorkers to visit and be seen by their friends. I was so very proud of the beautiful park we had created so the public could enjoy the rural scenery I remembered as a boy.
Vaux and I decided to call our new endeavor landscape architecture.
Now, there was considerable discussion between us about this title. Vaux thought our work was similar to an architect's. We were carefully arranging all the various functions required within the strict park boundaries, somewhat like an architect does with the rules of a building, but our endeavor took place entirely outdoors.
And I also must tell you that landscape architecture sounded far better than our second choice, which was rural embellisher. Can you imagine? Frederick Law Olmsted, rural embellisher.
With the huge success of Central Park, you might think that I had finally found a successful career. But that was not to be my fate.
As I feared, when I first accepted the park superintendent position, this job would seriously tax my abilities to work for a corrupt city government and a meddling park commission.
One of the commissioners, Andrew Green, was appointed comptroller, and he zealously looked after every cent I spent on the park. Many were the times I had to pay for services out of my own pocket, then argue with Green, and wait for weeks or months to be reimbursed. Part of the problem was that we had already spent 4 times the original budget of $1.5 million. The reason being, the commission had added those 40 unplanned bridges, and they also kept pushing me to hire more men in order to expedite the schedule. The park was so popular with the public, the politicians wanted it completed and open right away. I, of course, wanted it constructed properly, even if that took longer. At one point, I had 3,600 men working for me. But they weren't necessarily the best men for the job. Many of the workers were part of the city's corrupt political patronage system. I was so frustrated I threatened to resign unless they gave me more control of the money and the ability to hire and fire workers. They gave in to a few of my demands, but ignored the more important ones.
I cannot remember how many times I resigned or threatened to resign, but it became obvious to me that I could no longer work under these stressful conditions.
And then a dramatic turn of events occurred, which resolved the situation, at least for the time being. The conflict over slavery between the North and the South finally erupted into bloody civil war.
Being a patriot, I felt a profound sense of responsibility to serve my country. But with my lameness, I was not physically able to serve in a military capacity.
However, I was soon asked to become the executive secretary of the newly formed United States Sanitary Commission, which began when several churches were very concerned about the health and welfare of our Union soldiers. I continued to be architect-in-chief of Central Park but almost all my time and efforts went into helping our brave and injured soldiers. Not content to stay in the Washington, D.C. headquarters, I went out in the field and traveled with the Army on the Peninsula campaign. I soon became aware that the Union Army and its officers were neither prepared nor competent to succeed in their campaign. More men were dying from poor health and disease than they were in battle.
I, of course, pointed this out to the Army commanders, and they, of course, were not receptive to my suggestions for better medical care. I'm afraid I made some enemies in the Army, and this was not wise.
Having exhausted myself in the field, I returned to Washington, where I soon found myself arguing with the Sanitary Commission's governing board. The board wouldn't give me enough authority or funds to do my job, as I thought it should be done.
After 2 years with the Sanitary Commission, I finally resigned. Another failure.
Exhausted and depressed, I returned to my family and once again tried to organize my life and look toward a successful career.
I was disgusted with the war, New York politics, Central Park, and meddling governing boards.
I decided I needed to get out of the big cities and back to the rural countryside. This time, way out west in the promising new state of California. After another loan from my father, I entered a partnership with the Mariposa Gold Mining Company and accepted the position of superintendent.
My new responsibility was to organize the operations and assure the company of a profit.
As I reviewed the maps for the potential leases of property in the mountains, I discovered a valley called Yosemite by the Indians who lived there. I had never seen a place with such natural beauty, and after careful thought, considered it my duty to preserve this exquisite valley. So, I formed a commission which wrote a report and submitted it to California's governor, the Honorable Frederick Law, recommending the valley be preserved. The commission's report stated that this beautiful valley must be set aside and preserved for all mankind and all future generations. The report was successful, and as you know, Yosemite Valley has now become a park.
But the Commission's report also convinced my new employer that I was somewhat like the fox guarding the hen house at the prospect of expeditiously mining this valley.
So once again, I had acted against the wishes of my superiors, and once again, I found myself unemployed and a failure. Fortunately, I had continued to correspond with my former partner, Clavert Vaux, who contacted me and said he had obtained a commission to design a new park project and asked me to return and resume our partnership. So, I journeyed back to New York City with my family, and Vaux and I began work on our second public park, Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And that's when my exciting new career as a landscape architect finally sprang forth with the flush of success.
However, I was not yet finished with Central Park. It had been the turning point in my life and my career, but it represented a ball and chain I'd dragged around for decades.
The commissioners needed me again, but I couldn't work with them, and moreover, they did not respect me. And yet, I kept going back, designing, improving, and expanding the park. In 1865, I was reappointed Architect-in-Chief and resigned 5 years later. I was again reappointed in 1871 and finally quit for good in 1878.
I had battled the Park Commission and politicians on and off for 20 long years, and I have many unfortunate memories. However, when I look back upon my life's work, I'm particularly proud of my accomplishments at Central Park. I designed and built it to enhance the lives of all classes of people in New York City. And most of all, I profoundly believe that it is the highest calling of my profession as a landscape architect to provide rural scenery for everyone to enjoy. The scenery that I remembered as a boy.